I'll never forget when I first started with Virgin Unite some 20 some years ago now. My first day, Richard Branson, who's my boss, handed me a letter, and it was from Nelson Mandela to him and the musician Peter Gabriel, and it said, "Let's start the elders." And so Richard handed it to me, and he said, "Okay, let's start this." And I remember sitting there thinking, "Oh my God, I've just quit this amazing job in Australia, and now I've come to work with this crazy person with a beard."
Hello, and welcome to the Scientista podcast, where women in science rule. This podcast is all about supporting powerful women who lead with their brains. I'm behavioral scientist Dr. Shata Chakraborty.
And I'm former Assistant Secretary of State Monica Medina. The Scientista podcast brings you conversations with leaders, changemakers, and cultural figures, sharing how they're turning facts and evidence into real-world impact. So let's dive in.
So today we are so thrilled to have with us Jean Oelwang, the founding CEO and president of Virgin Unite. And for those of you listening in where that might sound familiar, yes, it's one of Richard Branson's many initiatives. So it is an entrepreneurial foundation that builds collectives, it incubates ideas, it reinvents systems for a better world. And Jean has spent so many decades really putting people and planet first. She has worked at over 25 Virgin businesses across 15 industries. And she's worked also on 6 continents. She's started and led mobile phone companies in places like South Africa, Colombia, Bulgaria. So this is someone who's all about connecting, I think it's fair to say. And she even spent a year as a Vista volunteer to help homeless teens in Chicago. So she's got some United States savvy in her as well. We're going to get into all of this and so much more by first asking her, Jean, firstly, thank you so much for joining us. I know Monica's really excited to have you with us as well. Tell us about your early days. You mastered this work of bringing people together, really connecting people. When did those skills really start for you? Talk to us maybe about your first job and the hints that this job gave you of the future career trajectory that you were going to have.
Yeah, thanks, Chetan. Thanks, Monica. What an honor to be here with you guys today. And I know you guys have had a lot of my heroes on the podcast, like Sylvia Earle and Catherine Hayhoe. And I'd urge anyone that's listening to listen to and Gina McCarthy, to listen to their podcast as well. They're brilliant. So actually, very, very ironically, my very, very first job is that I was a waitress in a Irish-Mexican restaurant. So you can't get as different of that in terms of a combination of foods. But really, I think where I started to really focus on bringing together unlikely partners and realizing that our systems were broken when I was a Vista volunteer, as you mentioned, Shed, and I had the deep honor to be in Center City, Chicago, working with homeless teenagers and refugees from Vietnam. And, it was there that I really realized how broken our systems are, that, we had government, we had business, and we had not-for-profit, and all of those systems were letting these teenagers fall through the cracks. And there was something like 70,000 teenagers living on the streets as young as 12 years old. And so it was at that moment that I became obsessed with how do you start bringing together sectors to really solve our problems? And these problems are systemic. And so we need people from across divides, people that are unlikely characters. And I remember right after that, I started moving around the world, helping start up mobile phone companies. And what was really interesting is we were able to start up those companies really quickly. But in countries, whether it was South Africa or Colombia or the US or Bulgaria, we had a lot of the same environmental and social issues, but we weren't scaling those as rapidly as we were able to scale businesses. So I got really focused on how do you do that? And I remember once talking to the amazing Robert Georges, who's if people in the US know, he's on the very far right side, and Cornel West, who's on the very far left side. And I had this beautiful conversation with them. And, they've come across divides and they are best friends, even though they have unbelievable difference in opinion across everything you can imagine. But when I finished that interview with them, they turned to me and they said, go out and find someone that makes you feel uncomfortable and befriend them. And that's something that always sticks in my head now about how do we bring across the table people of deep difference and different perspectives so that we can build those bridges, because that's the only way we're going to drive that systemic change.
It's so important to reach across divides, especially now when we're so divided. And you've always had a knack for spotting talent, for knowing what initiatives might have a real chance of succeeding and doing just that. Things like the Elders, the Carbon War Room, Planetary Guardians. So give us a hint about how you spot talent, and how do you know when an investment idea or a nonprofit idea might really actually have legs, might be able to do some real good. Tell us about that, sixth sense that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think my sixth sense is actually a multiplied sixth sense because I've never done anything alone. Like the teams, the partners that I've worked with, that's where that sixth sense comes in. Because if I have a blind spot, one of them is going to catch it. But I think when we're trying to think about what we focus our efforts on, we have a fundamental principle that's never accept the unacceptable. So if we see something that's unacceptable, we have to figure out some way to tackle that, and then trying to figure out, is this idea that someone's brought to us or that we've seen, is it audacious enough? Is it crazy enough? Is it going to drive systemic change rather than just be a Band-Aid? So that's another filter we look at. And I'll never forget when I first started with Virgin Unite some 20 some years ago now. My first day, Richard Branson, who's my boss, handed me a letter, and it was from Nelson Mandela to him and the musician Peter Gabriel, and it said, "Let's start the Elders." And so Richard handed it to me, and he said, "Okay, let's start this." And I remember sitting there thinking, "Oh my God, I've just quit this amazing job in Australia, and now I've come to work with this crazy person with a beard." And but it was that bringing together, and that's what the next thing we always do is figuring out who else is doing it already, making sure there's a gap that we can fill, and then bringing everyone together. And it's those partners that really are the ones that help us say, actually, this is a really shocking idea. Don't go there. Someone already is doing it. Or, yeah, this is a gap, and let's do it, and let's go together. And to your question, Monica, about how you know when something's really going to work, like with the Elders, I'll never forget, like it was a crazy idea. And, I can tell you hundreds of people slammed the doors in our faces every time we went to talk to them.
Really?
Yeah, because they were like, why? And, and this was, you have to remember, some 20 years ago when we started this. And they're like, what is this group going to do? Why would you bring it together? And the moment it really came together was the very first meeting of the Elders. And we were in South Africa. And I will never forget, Mandela got out of the car and he started walking down this path, and people from all communities all over South Africa had come and formed this human corridor of joy and love and dancing and singing. And he walked down the middle of this path. It gives me chills just even remembering it. And he sat at the table and gave this beautiful speech. And there was other elders, potential elders in the room, because we hadn't started, like Tutu and Mary Robinson and President Carter. And I remember Kofi Annan couldn't come, but he was on the screen. And I remember Kofi saying on the screen, "I'm in." And it was almost like our hearts knew then that it was going to happen. And Randy Newcomb from a Meteor Network, one of our partners at the time, he was in the room, and he and Pam wrote us a note saying, "We're in." And it was this momentum that became unstoppable. So I think it's that moment when you get the right people, the right alchemy, the right mix. And I'd say also sometimes you just know an idea is right because the science is so clear. And, I will never forget, 12 years ago, listening to Johan Rockström when he was unveiling his book at Davos. And I remember it was an early morning, like 6 a.m. We trudged across the ice in Davos, and I thought the room was going to be filled with people. And literally there was a handful of us. And he presented the science, and I thought, my God, this is so clear, this planetary boundary science, that we need to stay within these boundaries as humanity to have a world for generations to come. And so sometimes the idea just smacks you in the face because it is so clear. And that was the beginning of the Planetary Guardians, when we started working with Johan and thinking about what we could do to help support him.
Jean, I'm just taking in everything you're saying. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall in some of the experiences you're describing. How incredible. It's that momentum of influential impact makers, global shapers. These words are sometimes criticized for being overused, but that's actually who these people were, and you've been around them. from tech billionaires to former heads of state, you've been around people who can make real impact, who can really drive change, move markets, all of the different pieces that we need to see a collective global mobilization against what we're all fighting for here, this overcoming this climate crisis. What have you found is a common thread among these people that can actually drive this kind of real global systemic change?
Yeah, and thank you. I mean, for these people are extraordinary, and I should clarify that I don't put myself in the realm of those people, but I've had such an honor and privilege to sit at their feet, and I feel duty now to actually make sure that I am bringing their wisdom into the world. And there's been this deep red thread through. I think we've helped to start, I think, 22 collectives of these extraordinary leaders now, and incubated them to become independent. But the red thread that's come through all of this has been their ability to build deep connections with other people. So I think sometimes we think it's like their expertise, their name, their breadth of connections, but ultimately every one of them was able to build deep connections and then ladder them up to larger collaborations. And like just last week, we were had the good fortune of being on the ground with the Planetary Guardians in Indonesia. And Shetta and Monica, I can't say, it was like a master class watching Paul Pullman in action, for example. Like you could see over the years, he had built such strong connections on the ground in Indonesia, whether it was the government or whether it was with the business council or whether it was with frontline leaders. And so he was able to open those doors and people to trust him. And he came in it from a sense of humility, so listening and learning from them. And I think I saw that with the elders over the last 20 years. Like, I was in awe when I first met them 20 years ago. They were my heroes. And was fascinated to watch about how they became the people they were in the world and were able to make outsized impact. And what was very, very clear from the beginning, it was because of the relationships they built around them. And, Mary Robinson, just as one example, is like one of my biggest heroes in life. And she is the whole package. You can see she's built those deep connections. She has this extraordinary gentle power. And when I watched her at the helm and chair of the elders, she would, very quietly listen, let everyone speak, and then she'd just slam home with like the most important insight. And she has this deep moral courage where, like, I'm sure you guys saw her at COP in Glasgow, where she stood up, and, where she stood up in Dubai against fossil fuels, and, where she just last week, she was in Egypt standing up for Gaza. And she's also not afraid to be vulnerable. She's got this beautiful, and for all the female leaders listening right now, she has this beautiful mix of that gentle power, that wisdom, but she shows her vulnerability. Like you would have seen in COP in Glasgow, she cried on national TV. She wasn't afraid to do that because this is so important to her, and getting this right for future generations and for her grandchildren is so important. And I think the thing that impresses me the most is she has deep humility. I'll never forget, we were on the ground with the elders in South Africa, and Mandela had just sadly passed. And we were in a bus heading to Mandela's funeral. And many of us didn't have a pass to get into the stadium. And Mary knew that. And it was fascinating because I was watching all the other buses, and you could see the celebrities coming off the buses, running to the front so that they would get in the TV cameras when they got to the stadium. And what Mary did when she got off that bus is she got behind all of us, because she knew that if she was behind all of us, we would have the best chance of getting in, because she would then shepherd us in rather than her running forward. And it's a small example, but an important one about that sense of humility that we need in leadership today. And my God, the woman is so persistent and so committed. I have never seen, she just turned 80 and she never stops.
I had the privilege of being at some of those moments at those COPs, and she is the epitome of a selfless, moral leader, and not just on climate, but for the world. And she is so inspiring. She makes me cry when I hear her talk. But let's turn to the opposite end of the spectrum, because the kind of leader now that seems to be glorified and be sort of the pinnacle of what people think of as leadership is someone who's got a big ego and kind of I wonder who I'm thinking about, has a big ego and who bosses everyone around and doesn't listen, doesn't really have much humility. And it is hard to handle those people sometimes, and you've probably run into a few in your day. I'm not saying that you would have really enjoyed working with any of them, or I'm just wondering how you handle that, because I think for a lot of us in the world, particularly women, it's hard with people who have big egos and who tend not to lead like Mary Robinson.
Yeah, and being born in America, for every listener that's not an American, I just want to apologize right now because I think what's happening in America is, causing so much damage globally currently to so many people and people in America. And I think it's the epitome of what we've actually created as human beings, because I think we've pushed ourselves towards hyper individualism. And we're seeing that play out right now in these leaders who are focused on self interest, not being driven by the interests of the people, which is what they should be as leaders in nations right now. I think when you face folks like that, firstly, you can never, ever give up, because that's what they want us to do. And we can never give up. We have to keep on fighting. So that's number one, because they will use every tool in their toolbox of interest and individualism to beat us down. And I think, I learned over the years to use, I guess I would call it a phrase of urgent patience. So having the patience to let them talk and listen and let their ego shout, but then having that sense of urgency and that sense of something bigger, and bringing everyone at that table, lifting them back to why we are here as human beings, and that this should be a collective approach. It should be focused on collective interest and not individual interest, and bringing people back up to that sense of urgency in the moment we are right now, and getting people mobilized behind that something bigger. And that becomes unstoppable. And there are so many people doing so many good things out there right now. We need to lift their voices and not let the voices that are driven by ego have the podium. We need to lift the voices that are doing great stuff. And when you get that, like I'll never forget, like we had a most amazing experience when we were bringing together the Carbon War Room, which was an entity that was looking at market-based models to reduce carbon, with Rocky Mountain Institute, which is a house set up by Amory Lovins, which I'm sure everyone on this call knows. And I'll never forget that Jules Kortenhorst was at the helm at the time. And we decided we were going to merge these two organizations. And as you can imagine, all of us had a little bit of ego in this because,
Yeah, never easy.
yeah, we had to. But it was the most beautiful experience because we took the time to sit around the table, to listen to each other, to come out with a third way. And that third way solution then helped grow this organization from what was probably, $5 million organizations each individually to hundreds of millions now, doing amazing work in the world. So I think it's just learning how all of us tame our inner ego, because all of us are guilty of having egos, and set and have that sense of urgent patience. And I think that that also thinking about who are the right voices to tame the egos. And I'll never forget getting a group of business leaders who I had been working with for years, trying to get to put impact at the center. This is some 20 years ago now. And Paul Pullman was at the head of Unilever at the time. And I brought Paul into the room with these business leaders who weren't moving and weren't listening. And having Paul's voice there and showing him as a successful business leader who, he cried in front of that audience, his vulnerability, I can tell you that entire room was changed when we walked out. So I think it's all of us also thinking about who are the right voices at the right tables to shift people, and working through that. And I think it's also, and this is the last thing I'll say because I know I'm going on a bit, but I think that in America, we feel like we are so divided. We are not so divided. And they've created that myth right now. Like, I've had the great honor of sitting with farmers in Utah who are on the far right. And, when we have a conversation about planetary stewardship, they are right there alongside us, because they feel strongly that they want to protect their soil. They want to protect their land. They want to make sure that they're doing the right thing for future generations. So it's figuring out how we come across divides and hold those spaces right now.
It's figuring out how to speak to audiences, right? And this is a through line for Planetary Guardians that we've had the privilege of working with through We Don't Have Time, through the Global Commons Alliance. So many of our respective organizations have really come together and collaborated on understanding how to really communicate, because there's a science behind communicating as well. There's the planetary boundaries science, and then there's a way to communicate that science in a way that resonates with these different audiences. And, through the Global Commons Alliance and our collective work there, we've been able to really understand how to identify trusted spokespeople to reach those audiences. Now we've got to scale it. But you've been naturally doing this in your work for decades. And in those experiences, and thank you for sharing these anecdotes. They're incredible. They bring so much life to your career, and not just your career, what you live and breathe clearly day in and day out. But those listening are going to take away so much from this. Just what you just said about egos. We were talking before we got on this podcast about how he just dealt with this issue, dealing with egos and losing sight of that North Star, right? The bigger picture because of individuality and egoism. And so that, I think, is super helpful to reflect on in terms of how to address those inevitable scenarios that women, not just women allies as well, will inevitably come up against. So give us a few more anecdotes as well. So when you're around Nelson Mandela and Mary Robinson and Desmond Tutu, these names that are just legends in lore, but in your life, they were tangible. Tell us who they were as people, not just as public figures.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to answer both of those questions in one, and because I think it's a really important lesson for me that I learned some 20 years ago about being a female leader. And we had the good privilege to go. There's this amazing woman who put together, Cilla Elworthy, who put together this massive book of potential elders before we had started the elders. And so I had the really good fortune to go with Richard to go to sit in the living room of Nelson Mandela and Graça, his amazing wife, Graça Machel, to go through this book to choose the first group of the 12 elders. And so we walked into their humble home in Houghton in South Africa. And I'll never forget, I sat in the back, like I sat in the back corner, and I was letting, Richard and Mandela and Graça sit around a living room and around a table to go through this list. And Graça Machel, who, if people don't know her on this podcast, need to listen to her. She is an unbelievable, powerful leader. She was an environmental minister in Mozambique. She headed up the UN focus around children for I think it was slavery with children. She has done amazing work around education in her whole life. But anyway, Graça was sitting there with Mandela and Richard, and she stood up and walked to the back of the living room and dragged me to the conversation. And she said, you must sit in this conversation. You can add a lot of value in this conversation. And it was that reminder for all of us as females to bring other females to the table. That moment changed my life forever. It gave me the confidence to sit in that room, the confidence to understand that I may be able to add a little value into that conversation. It was extraordinary how she took that moment. And then it was just beautiful to see her and Mandela go through the entire book of thousands of names. And at each one, they would recognize someone and they would both just start to laugh or talk in joy about the friendship and the deep connection that they had with this extraordinary human being. And I remember when Mandela got to Tutu's page, he just started giggling and laughing. And he said, and this one, he has the gall to actually make fun of my colorful shirts when he wears a dress every single day. And of course, it was the purple robe that he wore every day. But it was, again, just seeing them as human beings and that they were who they were through these extraordinary people that they had built these deep connections with, whether it was Carter or Mary or Kofi or Tutu. And I could share a million moments like that where they were just so open and humble and loving and made you feel comfortable as soon as you walked in the room. And that's a good leader, because that's going to be what gets the best out of people. That's what's going to help people stand up into their best self. And again, that one moment in that living room changed the trajectory of my life forever. And Graça has been a dear friend my whole life now, and just helping me step into different moments at different times.
It's such an amazing story, and I think it's such a lesson for all of us women and scientists out there to find that courage to speak up and think about Graça and her reaching out to you, and imagine that happening to you when you feel intimidated out there trying to find your way in the world. Um, Let me ask another question about kind of adversity. You have probably had a few things that didn't work out so well. So many of your initiatives have been huge successes and really world changing, but I'm sure there've been some that haven't been so fantastic. Can you tell us about an initiative or a partnership that looked really perfect on paper, but then just didn't work out, and kind of what was the secret to navigating that?
Yeah, and I think, any success I've had has definitely been because of the great teams and partners I've had around me, and then any failures, I think, happen when I haven't taken the time to listen and when I haven't taken the time to get the right group of people in the room, and, that's happened a ton in my life, and, a couple examples, one is, 20 years ago, maybe 18 years ago, we tried to start this thing called a disease control hub across the African continent. And we were trying so hard to get it off the ground, particularly in South Africa, with the South African leadership. And I look back on that, and what we hadn't done right is we hadn't taken a learning from the ozone community, which did something amazing they called Start and Strengthen, where they got a handful of willing partners to work together to make something happen. And we had just been trying with one or two leaders. So every time a leader changed, we started again. And it ended up that never got off the ground because I think we hadn't really understood what was important to the different countries across the African continent. And, it was very funny because almost 20 years later, when COVID hit, we ended up working with the amazing John Nkengasong he was heading up the Africa CDC. And we worked with Arash Punjabi, who I know you've had on your podcast, Don Gibbs from Skoll, Strive Massawiya, Robin Calder, Jeff Skoll. And we got together just a small group on one call and said, what can we do right now for the African continent? It was at the very start of COVID. And it was fascinating because that one call, we got Africa CDC on, and they led the work. It was always them in the leadership position telling us what to do. And we ended up actually having 100 foundations that were working in Africa come together every single month, and 25 of them come together every week for 2 years, generating tens of millions of dollars. And so it was an interesting experience of looking at where we started that years before. We didn't listen and didn't get the right people in the room. When we did this virtually with COVID, we had the right people, the right call, led by Africa and led by John and Nkengasong and his team. And it was a whole different world. So I think that's one of the lessons that I would definitely take out of it. And we learned that at the front of the elders too, when 20 years ago, we built this perfect PowerPoint presentation. We thought we had the idea, and we went and gathered together, people from all over the world, business leaders, etc. And I'll never forget President Carter standing up at the first meeting saying, I don't believe in this idea. I don't think it's going to work. And nearly wanting to melt into the cement and disappear forever. But again, important learning is that we spent the next 3 weeks working with Carter, literally sitting in the sand, creating the idea, and all the other people that were there. And when we came out the other side, the idea was 1 trillion times better than our perfect PowerPoint. And, Carter, when he retired in his 90s from the elders, he stood up and he said, this is one of the most important things I've ever done in my life. And it was because he had that shared ownership. So whenever I have a failure, it's usually because I don't have shared ownership in the front end. And so I think that's been one of the most important lessons around failure.
So interesting. And I have to say, Dr. John Nkengasong is one of my heroes, too. I got to work with him at the State Department, and we both worked on global health issues, and it was an unbelievable partnership. And some of the things he was able to do, the rabbits he was able to pull out of hats, the people he could get on the phone when monkeypox just, popped up out of nowhere. Things like that were just amazing. And I'm a Georgia girl, so President Carter has always been a hero of mine. I just can't imagine what it must have been like to be able to, be in a room with him, with John, with all these amazing leaders. And you've already answered our last question, which is always about how do you deal with adversity. That was just an amazing, tutorial in kind of resilience. So let me end with a different question instead, which is what gives you hope? You are, we are all in the midst of a terribly challenging time. You are surrounded by these charismatic leaders, but even they must get discouraged by some of what's going on right now. So tell us about how you and they are finding resilience in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think people like the two of you, I mean, Shete and Monica, you guys have been fighting in this fight for a long time. And, I just, as I mentioned, came off the back of this trip in Indonesia, and there were these amazing young leaders like Shia Bastida and Farweezer Farhana and Aisha Sadiqa and Hindu Ibrahim. And how can you not have hope when you see them continuing to fight after years and years, and you see Mampeli Rampeli there, who was the leader of the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa, and you see them together and they have this incredible intergenerational arc as well. Gives me unbelievable hope with Paul Poman and Mampeli and Naoko Ishii, and then Sylvia and Jane, and then these young guardians. And I think, how can we ever think of giving up when you see this next generation fighting every second of their life right now? I mean, I think that's what gives me hope right now, and that's what every morning I get up, and people like Johan Rockstrom and scientists like the team at the Earth Commission as well. They believe in this so much, and they have been telling us for decades. I was just sharing that we were in Exeter with this group of 200 scientists who have been telling us for decades that we are on the edge of a precipice right now. And, we talk about 1.5 as a goal. It is not a goal. It is a cliff. And, that's where people don't understand the urgency of, and you see these scientists, and they give me hope because they're not giving up. And they've been telling us this for decades, and we cannot let them down.
And we trust in science, and science says we can still overcome this. So there is no excuse to stop fighting. Jean, you are so humble, and you as a communicator are just fantastic. You're so inspirational, and we know our listeners have taken so much away from this conversation. Truly, thank you for taking your time, sharing your experiences with us. We look forward to having you be a scientista with us as we grow, and potentially bring you back in the near future to continue to share your stories and the future of Planetary Guardians. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. And thanks for doing this podcast right now at a time that we all need to stand with science and uplift it, and never, ever again let people undermine it.
Thank you. And thanks to all those listening to the Scientista podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, help others to discover it by leaving a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you've listened to this. We really appreciate your support, and we can't wait to bring you our next guest.
And you can always find us at scientista.world for more stories, updates, and ways to get involved.